Hi, my name is Jennifer Lay, and this will be a three-part video series titled The Darker Devils of Our Nature. It is a spin-off Steven Pinker's book titled The Better Angels of Our Nature. In Pinker's book, he argues that violence has greatly decreased, especially when you compare its prevalence in history. In this video series, we will be exploring, however, how perhaps it is not that violence has decreased, but instead it has assumed different forms in the modern context. And we will also be looking at how violence is actually deeply rooted in our human nature and systemic societal structure, and what all of this would mean in terms of justice and morality. So it's quite a handful of a topic, and that's why I am splitting it into three parts. And yeah, without further ado, let's jump right into the darker devils of our nature: violence, deviance, and crime. Part 1. Violence. What comes to your mind when the word violence is mentioned? The typical understanding of violence would be the use of physical force to inflict or threaten bodily harm unto another individual or group. One might commit this act with the purpose to destroy, abuse, or manipulate. This is understood to be subjective violence. However, in an interesting video by PBS Idea Channel titled "What is Violence?", it is proposed that violence could also be defined as a removal of choice. In the video, the example used was the tying up of an individual to a chair. By tying up the hostage's arms and legs, it removes their choice to stand up, walk away, or scratch their nose. Although no real bodily harm is inflicted or threatened onto the hostage, through the tying up of this individual, and hence the restriction of their agency, one could forcefully coerce the hostage to one's bidding. In a way, this is a form of violence. Under the aforementioned definition, objective violence arises. The removal of choice basically means the removal of agency from an individual, or the limiting of an individual from freely acting on their will. Under objective violence, there is symbolic and systemic violence. An example of symbolic violence would be the active act of conducting hate speech towards an individual or group. Systemic violence, on the other hand, needs not be active. To quote Vincenzo Ruggiero on the definition of systemic violence mentioned in his book, Visions of Political Violence, systemic violence refers to the harm people suffer from the social structure and the institutions sustaining and reproducing it. Obviously, this is something that is much trickier to detect, especially when one is in the power seat and is therefore unable to immediately experience the downsides to the system. Hence, when members or classes of a system fail to recognize their privileges, the underprivileged members of the current system receive the short end of the stick, whilst the system is unjustly perpetuated. A brilliant example of this concept is depicted in the movie Parasite. An example of a group that experiences systemic violence would be prison inmates. One might argue that because these inmates have committed crimes and disobeyed the laws, their autonomy is justifiably taken away. However, in Malaysia, it is estimated that up to 37% of inmates are actually innocent. They are either in remand or simply unable to afford bail. Furthermore, it is estimated that 80% of mentally ill inmates were unable to receive psychiatric care prior to their incarceration. As we are not prison inmates and live relatively comfortable lives far away from prisons, we have little reason to demand systemic change or question our own privileges. However, in the shoes of an inmate, the immensely unsanitary and inhumane conditions one has no way of avoiding is systemic violence. Who can help them? Part 2. Deviance. In sociology, deviance refers to actions and behaviors that not only defy informal social norms, but sometimes also formally enacted laws. Though this term may carry negative connotations, deviance should not necessarily be something one should react aversely towards. Think again of prison inmates. The very reason they are in prison is because they have violated formal laws and are therefore deviant. Although all inmates could be labeled as deviants, not all are inherently evil. To illustrate this point, take marijuana use as an example. In Malaysia, marijuana use for recreational purposes is illegal. However, in Switzerland, it is perfectly legal. Furthermore, one's decision for marijuana use says very little about one's ethics or morality, or even the likelihood of them inflicting harm onto another individual. Thus, offenders in Malaysia may be deemed deviant, but they are not definitely all dangerous or bad people. Moving on from the violation of laws, what about the violation of social norms? Social norms allow for societal trust, concord, and stability. Extremely deviant behavior often dabbles onto the grounds of unhealthiness and public danger, and thus is discouraged and oftentimes socially unacceptable. With that said, however, deviance should not simply be viewed as something to be pruned completely from society. Deviances can serve functional purposes such as the clarification of norms, the strengthening of conformations, and the challenging of present views which may lead to positive social change. Additionally, according to social control theory, it is suggested that deviance arises when one's social attachments or bonds are weakened. This may be due to various external reasons outside of one's control. This ties back to the previous subject of systemic violence and is actually also explained under labeling theory. Labeling theory suggests that the definitions of deviance and criminality are simply established by those who hold most power in society. In other words, the select groups that happen to benefit from the current societal systems have the most say in determining the rules of the playing ground. With that said, currently privileged groups not only have little incentive to alter the system, but would try to preserve the status quo in order to preserve one's privileges. The alienation and criminalization of deviance may then be perceived as evidence of enforced systemic violence and inequality. Part 3. Crime. Laws exist to enforce order, equity, and safety. In order to do so, certain actions are made illegal or criminal, and so crimes are actions determined by the law to be punishable through punishments such as, but not limited to, fines, imprisonment, caning, and even death. What grants fellow humans the authority to physically punish one another is a discussion for another day, though. Does criminal behavior equate to morally and fundamentally wrong behavior? As mentioned in the previous section, apparently, crimes are not standardized across nations. There are clear no-goes such as murder, rape, stealing, and corruption. These are actions in which one party is harmed by another and is therefore clearly immoral. However, oftentimes countries and even political parties within a country disagree on what merits punishment and what doesn't. Usually, parties disagree on issues surrounding the use of specific substances, such as recreational marijuana use in Malaysia and gum chewing in Singapore. To further exemplify how the definitions of crime can differ across nations, in Malaysia, abortion is generally illegal, unless the pregnancy imposes a medical complication or threat, while in Singapore, abortion is perfectly legal. Then there is America, in which exists different states, with some states legalizing and other states criminalizing abortion. Even within a state that has clearly enforced its legal stance on abortion, there still exists opposing parties that disagree on whether or not abortion should be legalized. A good question to ask oneself is, does legal stance reflect one's moral stance? Moving on, there is also the factor of time. Prior to 1933, the consumption, production, and transportation of alcohol was banned in America. As we all know now, alcohol can be legally consumed at a minimum age which also differs across nations. However, should you have been 22 years old in the year 1932 and wanted to celebrate with champagne, you would be very much breaking the law. What makes of all those lawbreakers prior to 1933? And what makes of all of us alcohol consumers now? Will more and more actions become decriminalized in the future? And how likely is it that we are currently committing crimes that the future would deem illegal? Though law enforcement and criminal justice supposedly exists to enforce order, equity, and safety, we have learned that this is not always the case. Furthermore, laws seem to be subjected to time, which in retrospect may be argued as somewhat unfair for all of us. With that said, crime proves to be merely a product of society, culture, and time. As any one of these factors differ, so do the definitions of crime. While morally wrong actions are almost always crimes, not all crimes are always morally wrong. Part 4. The hidden motives of human behavior. After all of that said, the supposedly black and white of right and wrong, normal and deviant, legal and criminal, has revealed its true colors to be a giant blended blob of gray. There seems to be no identifiable protagonist or antagonist in society, although everyone would seem to think themselves as the protagonist. No person intentionally acts to be the antagonist of the storyline. Behind every action is a logical and/or ideological rationalization behind one's motives. An example of a rationalization would be when terrorists not only kill others but kill themselves in the name of self-righteous beliefs indoctrinated by the terrorist group. Though we may self-rationalize, self-deceive, and also deceive others about our motives behind our actions, we are all inherently fueled by self-interest or self-gain. We can see this in our desires to flaunt, compete, win, dominate, and control. It fuels businesses, art, the economy, and institutions. The employment and existence of systemic violence and the criminalization of deviance are all evidences of these not-so-nice-to-hear natures of ourselves. However, they are the fundamental natures of humanity that we mask from one another and sometimes ourselves. On the other hand, although humans are fundamentally selfish and, on a certain level, violent by nature, we as a society commend and promote altruism, empathy, and compassion. The common theme to these three qualities is the element of selflessness, or the transcendence of the self. The element of selflessness is also a key praxis of major religions and philosophies. Nevertheless, from pro bono healthcare and education services to selfless acts of charitable giving, one can uncover strategic benefits that lead to greater self-gain than loss most of the time. An insightful and clever book on the hidden motives behind our everyday actions is The Elephant in the Brain by Kevin Simler and Robin Hanson. It is highly debatable whether 100% pure and selfless altruism, empathy, and compassion truly exists. However, the superficial belief in it facilitates the trust which is necessary for society as a whole to function and develop. Nonetheless, if we as a society truly seek equitable and sustainable growth and development, we must become self-aware of these darker devils of our nature and take them into account when we develop policies or design new institutions. Hey, I'm back. Like my face and my body, I'm back. And yeah, that marks the end of this first part of the Darker Devils of Our Nature series. You can find a link of all the resources that I mentioned throughout the video down in the description box below. And if you want to read like an article version of everything that I just mentioned here with references and all, and also some visuals that I put in, you can head down to the link below as well for an article version of this video. And in the next part of this series, the second installment, we will be investigating the dark motives that actually make up supposedly gleaming and perfect institutions such as legal systems, prisons, healthcare, education, and charity foundations. And in the third and final part of this series, we will also be looking at dismantling and restructuring our definitions and perceptions of morality and justice. And we will also be attempting to construct a framework for systemic change. And yeah, I hope this video and this video series will strike up a thought or two in that little noggin of yours. And yeah, heavy and interesting, hopefully, stuff coming your way. And thanks for watching and have a good day. Bye.